At 30,000 feet over Nazi-controlled Budapest, a flak shell didn't damage a B-17. It erased its entire nose. 1 second there was a cockpit. The next, there was only open sky and screaming wind. No instruments. No controls. 2 crewmen gone instantly. By every law of aviation, the bomber should have dropped straight out of the sky. Instead, it kept flying. Somewhere inside the shattered fuselage, men were fighting the aircraft itself, pulling on something they were never meant to touch. For 10 minutes over enemy territory, this B-17 refused to fall. How it stayed airborne is almost impossible to believe. At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Evald Swanson gripped the controls of his B-17G Flying Fortress as the sky above Budapest erupted in black bursts of flak. He was only 24 years old, already 17 missions deep, and flying with no room for mistakes. Below them, German defenses had ringed the rail yards with hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft guns, all firing at once. Swanson's bomber was one aircraft in a tight 60-plane formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, launched from Sturparone, Italy. On paper, the objective sounded straightforward. Their orders were brutally clear. Hit the Shell oil refinery and the rail network at the center of German-occupied Budapest, cripple the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front, and make it back alive. By mid-1944, crews of the 15th Air Force understood the odds. For every 10 men who boarded a B-17, only 2 could expect to see home again. The rest would be killed, captured, or vanish without a trace. Still, the formation pushed ahead into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Flak detonated in violent black bursts, tearing through aluminum skin. MSPA absorbed multiple hits, first in the tail, then across its wings, but stayed in formation. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage, punching jagged holes in the aircraft's skin, yet the bomber held its place in the formation. Inside, every crewman stayed at his post. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt remained beside Swanson in the co-pilot's seat. Up front, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley prepared the bomb sight in the nose, while Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson worked navigation just behind him. The remaining crew were spread throughout the aircraft: radio operator, gunners, flight engineer, each waiting for the release point. The target was seconds away. Dudley armed the system and released the bombs. 2 tons of explosives fell away toward the rail yards below, and the sudden loss of weight forced the bomber sharply upward. Almost immediately, an 88mm shell slammed into the aircraft's nose. The detonation was instant and catastrophic. Everything forward of the cockpit vanished in a flash of fire and debris. The nose section, the bombardier's station, the navigator's compartment, the bomb sight, and the plexiglass framing were all torn away. There was nothing left where the front of the aircraft had been. Kenneth Dudley was killed instantly. Joe Henderson never had a chance. The shockwave ripped through the remaining structure, leaving the bomber shattered but still in the air. The metal frame that once held 2 men and countless pounds of equipment had vanished. The bomber's center of gravity swung violently backward. With nothing weighing down the nose, MSPA pitched almost vertically, threatening to stall. Swanson stared at nothing but open sky where the instruments should have been. At 30,000 feet, freezing air tore through the gaping hole, biting at every layer of his flight suit. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, and the wind ripped at him mercilessly. Blood from the initial explosion smeared the flight deck, a grim reminder of the chaos around him. Through the gaping void where the nose had once been, Swanson could make out the rest of the formation pushing toward the rally point. The control column was gone. The yoke that normally guided the flight surfaces had been mounted to the forward structure, and that structure no longer existed. Every instrument panel had been ripped away with the nose. No airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon. Nothing to show him the aircraft's orientation except the horizon itself and the feel of the plane beneath him. Yet, somehow, The steel control cables running through the fuselage had survived, exposed but intact, offering the only link between pilot and aircraft. The steel cables running from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons swayed wildly in the rushing wind, fully exposed yet miraculously intact. Swanson yanked at the controls, or at least tried to, but there was nothing left to guide the plane. Somehow, against all logic, he managed to bring MSPA's nose down, level the bomber, and slip it back into a rough formation with the others. The aircraft should have been uncontrollable. Boeing had designed the B-17 for stability, but no engineer, no manual, had ever imagined flying one with the cockpit obliterated. The only thing keeping MSPA in the sky now was sheer physics and raw desperation. Behind Swanson, the surviving crew began moving forward, the radio operator, the flight engineer, each inching through the chaos of the cabin. Through the bomb bay, they could see the steel control cables whipping violently in the wind. The gale ripped through the open fuselage, but the men understood instantly what had to be done. Every second counted. Every movement was critical. The fate of the bomber, and everyone still alive on board, rested entirely in their hands. Over 200 anti-aircraft guns continued to fire relentlessly. MSPA remained deep in enemy territory when another shell found its mark, striking engine number 2 at exactly 9:44 a.m. The right cyclone radial detonated in a violent spray of oil and metal, flames licking back along the inboard section of the left wing. The propeller spun uncontrollably for a few seconds before locking completely. Engine number 2 was gone. MSPA was suddenly down to 3 engines, losing speed fast, while the rest of the formation edged steadily ahead. Every moment now increased the danger of falling behind, or worse. With all cockpit instruments gone, Swanson had no way to gauge how far behind the formation they were falling. Technical Sergeant Frank Gmenzi, the flight engineer, crawled forward from the top turret, eyes widening as he assessed the situation. Steel control cables, rudder, elevator, and aileron lines stretched through the fuselage in thick bundles, each about 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Normally hidden within pulleys and reinforced panels, they were now fully exposed, whipping violently in the wind. The fragility of the bomber's controls was laid bare, and it was immediately clear, without intervention, MSPA would be lost. The wind ripped at the exposed cables, threatening to yank the bomber out of control. If no one held them steady, MSPA would spiral into disaster. Without hesitation, Staff Sergeant George Semelli advanced from the radio compartment, while Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They positioned themselves in the bomb bay where the main cable runs were fully visible. There was no debate, no plan, only instinct. Someone had to keep the cable steady. Someone had to pull at exactly the right moment, giving Swanson the control he no longer possessed. The real challenge was coordination. Swanson sat in what remained of the cockpit, 40 feet ahead of the rest of the crew, while the men struggled to manage the cables in the bomb bay. The intercom was damaged, making communication nearly impossible. Swanson pressed the rudder pedals. Nothing. The pedals remained, but the cables they controlled were being torn by winds exceeding 300 miles per hour. He adjusted the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded, at least partially. But without direct control of the flight surfaces, the B-17 threatened to veer out of formation, risking a deadly dive at any moment. Even worse, the bomber could pitch up, stall, and enter a deadly spin, guaranteeing death for everyone on board. The crew sprang into action. They wrapped sections of the exposed steel cables around their gloved hands, fighting the freezing metal that cut through their gloves. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, MSPA's nose turned left. Pull right. It turned right. The elevators responded the same way. Pull back. The nose rose. Release. It dropped. Every movement required perfect timing. Too much force, and the plane would overreact. Too little, and nothing would happen. Their survival depended entirely on precision and instinct. Too little pressure, and the aircraft wouldn't respond at all. The crew was operating blindly, unable to see what Swanson saw, unaware of the exact corrections he needed, and completely without instruments or gauges. MSPA began to lag behind the formation. The other B-17s pressed on, maintaining speed and heading southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson's crippled bomber struggled to keep up. The missing nose created massive drag, and the loss of an engine sapped precious power. The formation wasn't slowing down, and there was no time to wait. Every second now increased the risk of being left vulnerable over enemy territory. Every passing minute over Hungary increased the threat from enemy fighters and relentless flak. Standard procedure was unforgiving. Any aircraft unable to keep pace with the formation was left behind. By 9:46 a.m., MSPA was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then two distant dark silhouettes against the summer sky. Swanson's bomber was steadily losing altitude, first from 30,000 feet to 29,000, then 28. Through the chaos, the crew gripped and pulled the steel cables. Their hands cramped, raw from the biting cold, circulation cut off by the unforgiving metal. Still, they refused to let go. The fuel situation remained a terrifying unknown. With the instrument panel gone, all gauges obliterated, Swanson had no clue how much fuel remained in the wing tanks. He had no way to know how long 3 engines could keep them aloft, or even whether they were on the right course. Navigation normally relied on instruments, maps, and the navigator, none of which were available. The navigator had been killed over Budapest. All he could do was steer southwest, out of Hungary, over Yugoslavia, toward the Adriatic, and ultimately back to Italy. Then, from somewhere behind him, the crew in the bomb bay began waving frantically. Swanson couldn't turn around to see them, but he understood. Something was terribly wrong. The hurricane-force wind blasting through the gaping nose made any movement deadly. If Swanson unbuckled from his seat, he risked being yanked forward and out of the aircraft entirely. He remained pinned, eyes fixed on the horizon, struggling to keep the wings level. Yet the crew in the bomb bay continued frantically waving. Something was gravely wrong in the rear section, far beyond the destroyed nose, the dead engine, and the exposed control cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had felt the shock of the initial explosion, and now he sensed another danger lurking at the very end of the aircraft. The tail was the most isolated part of a B-17, a cramped compartment at the very rear of the fuselage, reachable only by crawling on hands and knees through the waist gun area. Tucker had felt the initial impact, the violent pitch, the sudden stabilization, but now something worse was happening. The tail structure itself was flexing unnaturally. The metal framework supporting the vertical and horizontal stabilizers twisted and shifted in ways no aircraft should allow. Every creak and shudder hinted at imminent structural failure, a terrifying reminder that the bomber's survival depended on both steel and sheer luck. The explosion had likely caused stress fractures somewhere along the fuselage, or perhaps shrapnel had compromised critical support beams. Either way, the tail section was starting to fail. If it came off, there would be no chance for survival. A B-17 without its tail would enter an uncontrollable spin, tumbling end over end until it disintegrated or slammed into the ground. There would be no time to bail out, no time to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood the stakes instantly. Through the exposed fuselage, they could see the tail gunner's compartment flexing and shuddering, powerless to repair it, but determined to do whatever they could to keep the plane in the air. MSPA had dropped to 26,000 feet, still descending, still veering southwest. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4, maybe 5 minutes, each second stretching into an eternity. The wind roared like a hurricane, cutting through every layer of his flight suit, while his hands went numb on the throttles, the only controls left at his disposal. Engine power was all he could manipulate without the crew's help on the cables in the bomb bay. Beside him, Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, remained locked in his seat, eyes scanning the crippled aircraft for any sign of stabilization. The control column was gone. The instruments were gone. Swanson's only reference points were the wings, the engines, and the horizon as he scanned for enemy aircraft. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s prowled the skies, hunting lone bombers. A crippled B-17 separated from its formation was an easy target. No supporting fire, no backup, just one battered aircraft struggling to stay airborne over hostile territory. For now, though, no fighters appeared. The Luftwaffe was either engaged elsewhere or had yet to spot MSPA. Meanwhile, the crew continued pulling the exposed cables, their coordination steadily improving with each tense adjustment. Whenever Swanson throttled back engine number 1, MSPA wanted to yaw sharply to the right. Instantly, the crew pulled the left rudder cable to counter it. Increase power on engine 4, and they adjusted again. This wasn't flying. It was survival through sheer, coordinated brute force. 10 men acting as one, straining to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel aloft. At 9:50 a.m., MSPA crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson had no idea, no map, no recognizable landmarks through the gaping hole that had been his cockpit. For the first time in minutes, the relentless flak finally stopped. The black clouds of flak finally stopped. For the first time in minutes, it seemed they had passed the worst of the enemy defenses. It offered a glimmer of hope, a slim, fragile chance. A chance that hinged entirely on how long the tail structure could hold, how long the crew could keep pulling the exposed cables, and whether 3 engines could produce enough thrust to keep them airborne. The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson felt the hum and vibration of the engines through the battered airframe. They were still running smoothly, indicating the wing tanks were not empty. How much fuel remained, no one could know. A fully loaded B-17 carried roughly 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline across multiple tanks. At normal cruise power, four engines would burn around 200 gallons per hour, but they weren't cruising. The bomber was pushing 3 engines at maximum continuous power just to maintain altitude and speed, driving fuel consumption far higher than normal. Swanson faced a grim reality and made a single, urgent decision: get the crew out. The aircraft was failing. The tail structure was compromised. Fuel levels were unknown, and they were still deep over enemy territory. Every second counted. Every additional minute in the air raised the risk of total structural collapse. If MSPA came apart at altitude, there would be no survivors. But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft remained partially controllable, most had a chance to live. Capture was almost certain. They would spend months in prisoner-of-war camps, but at least they could survive. The challenge lay in execution. Bailing out of a B-17 required precise coordination, following strict procedures with designated exit points. Any misstep could mean instant death. Normally, the bombardier and navigator would escape through the forward nose hatch, but that hatch no longer existed. The radio operator and others would use the waist gun windows or the rear door. The ball turret gunner had to rotate his turret into a precise position before climbing out. Each crew member had drilled these procedures countless times during training, but training assumed a fully intact aircraft. It assumed a functioning intercom. It assumed there was time for an orderly evacuation. Swanson had none of that. No intercom. No way to issue commands. No time. Every second was a fight against chaos itself. Swanson had no way to coordinate who should exit first and who last. And he could not leave his seat. The instant he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward any exit, the aircraft risked becoming uncontrollable. The crew in the bomb bay would lose their reference points for pulling the cables. MSPA would spin or dive within seconds, and everyone still aboard would be lost. By 9:52 a.m., they had dropped to 24,000 feet. 10 harrowing minutes had passed without a cockpit. Swanson's hands remained locked on the throttles, every nerve focused on keeping the bomber airborne. Swanson's feet pressed against the rudder pedals, even though the pedals alone could do nothing without the crew's hands pulling cables 30 feet behind him. Beside him, Burnt sat frozen in the co-pilot's seat, eyes locked on the horizon, scanning the wings, watching for any hint of catastrophic failure. Neither man spoke. The roaring wind made conversation impossible anyway. Farther back, the crew in the bomb bay made a grim decision on their own. They could feel the tail structure flexing, see stress cracks spreading across the fuselage. They understood the brutal truth. Staying aboard meant certain death if the aircraft came apart. One by one, the men began inching toward the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first, clipping his parachute harness, positioning himself carefully, and then leaping into the violent slipstream. He was instantly swept away by the rushing air. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly followed, then Staff Sergeant George Semelli, and finally Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie. With each jump, MSPA became harder to control. Fewer hands on the exposed cables meant less precise adjustments. The bomber began to wallow, wings dipping left, then right, the nose pitching up slightly. Swanson fought to compensate with the throttles alone, though they were no longer enough to fully stabilize the aircraft. Swanson needed the rudder. He needed the elevators. He needed the hands on the cables, but the crew was abandoning ship. They had no choice. It was the only rational decision in a failing aircraft. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner's position, squeezing through the cramped passage to reach the waist gun area. He emerged to find the positions where his crewmates had stood moments before now empty. The exposed control cables hung slack, lifeless without anyone gripping them. MSPA trembled violently under the strain, and Tucker knew the plane was balancing on the edge of disaster. Tucker's eyes locked on the massive gaping hole where the nose had once been, 40 feet ahead. He clipped on his parachute and launched into the slipstream. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men had evacuated, descending under parachute canopies over Yugoslavia. 5 would be captured by German forces within hours, but 5 had survived the day. That left 5 men still aboard MSPA. Swanson at the pilot's seat, Burnt in the co-pilots, and 3 others yet to reach the exit points. The bomber trembled beneath them, every second a test of nerves, skill, and sheer luck. At 22,000 feet, MSPA continued its steady descent, barely controllable, the tail structure teetering on the brink of catastrophic failure. The remaining crew moved toward the exits with grim determination. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, the waist gunner, slipped through the window opening, his parachute deploying perfectly. Seconds later, Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker followed, leaving only 3 men aboard. Swanson at the pilot's seat, Burnt in the co-pilots, and 1 final crew member crawling forward from a rear position. Every moment counted. The aircraft was literally unraveling beneath them, and the margin for error had vanished. MSPA shuddered violently, increasingly unstable. With nearly no hands left on the control cables, the bomber responded only to engine power and its inherent aerodynamic stability, a design meant for normal flight, not for flying without a nose or with a failing tail. At 9:56 a.m., the last crew member reached the waist gun area, clipped in, and plunged into the slipstream. Suddenly, only Swanson and Burnt remained, 2 men alone in the shattered remains of a B-17 flying fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The aircraft trembled beneath them, every second a fight against gravity and fate. The bomber continued its slow descent. 3 engines still roared, but MSPA was no longer truly controllable, barely clinging to the sky through residual stability and the lift the wings could still produce. With no crew left to manage the cables, precise control was impossible. Swanson turned slightly, locking eyes with Burnt. No words were exchanged. The wind would have drowned them out anyway. But the message was unmistakable. Burnt needed to jump. Every second was a race against the failing aircraft, every decision a gamble with life itself. There was no reason for the co-pilot to stay aboard. He had no controls, no role left to play. Remaining any longer meant certain death when the aircraft finally gave way or crashed. The only rational choice was to bail out while altitude remained high enough to deploy a parachute safely. Bernd unbuckled his harness and rose from the co-pilot's seat, moving cautiously toward the rear of the flight deck to reach the waist-gun exit. Before stepping into the slipstream, he cast one final glance at Swanson, a silent acknowledgement of the harrowing ordeal they had survived so far. Swanson remained locked in the pilot's seat, hands gripping the throttles, eyes fixed on the horizon, fighting to keep the dying bomber as steady as possible. Behind him, Bernd crawled through the narrow passage and moved aft. 30 seconds later, he jumped into the slipstream. Swanson was now completely alone, one man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet. MSPA descended steadily at roughly 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, but a relentless fall. The three remaining engines produced just enough thrust to maintain forward speed, but altitude was slipping away. With the nose gone, drag was enormous, and the aerodynamic balance destroyed. The B-17 had become little more than a flying brick with wings. Fuel levels were a complete mystery. The wing tanks could be nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to know. The engines gave no warning. The right cyclone radials ran smoothly until the fuel was entirely gone, then simply stopped. No sputter, no falter, just silence. And if all three engines cut out at once, MSPA would plummet from the sky, leaving Swanson with no options, no backup, and no margin for error. Every second was a tightrope walk over certain death. Swanson estimated their position. They had been heading southwest for roughly 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was likely around 180 miles per hour, maybe less, meaning they had covered approximately 40 to 45 miles. The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia lay about 30 miles from Budapest, suggesting they were now over Yugoslavia, perhaps nearing the mountains, or maybe the Adriatic coast. But all of this was guesswork. With no instruments, no maps, and no navigator, Swanson was flying blind, relying entirely on instinct, experience, and sheer will to keep the crippled bomber in the air. The critical question was how long to stay aboard. Every minute Swanson remained at the controls gave the crew below more time to distance themselves from the eventual crash site. German patrols would comb the area for any downed bomber. But if he could keep MSPA aloft for just a few more minutes, the parachuting crew might land miles away from where the aircraft would finally hit the ground. That separation could mean the difference between capture and evasion, between imprisonment and freedom. Yet every second aboard also increased the risk that Swanson himself would not survive the crash. The tail structure flexed dangerously, the bomber ready to tear apart at any moment. When Swanson finally chose to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand, navigate through the wrecked aircraft, and jump, while MSPA teetered uncontrollably, possibly on the edge of a deadly spin. At 9:58 a.m., he made his decision. He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes, giving the crew below extra distance from the crash site and a better chance at survival. Swanson's hands remained firmly on the throttles as the 3 right-side Cyclone engines continued their relentless roar, holding the fragile aircraft aloft. Engine number 1 on the far left wing, engine number 3 inboard on the right, and engine number 4 on the far right, all still running smoothly, consuming fuel at an unknown rate. MSPA descended through 18,000 feet. At exactly 10 a.m., Swanson released the throttles and unbuckled his harness. The moment the straps came loose, the violent slipstream threatened to pull him forward toward the massive gap where the nose had once been. He pressed back against the seat, then rose carefully. Immediately, the aircraft pitched under him, every movement amplified by the missing nose and failing structure, a deadly reminder that every second counted. With no hands on the throttles, and no one left to make corrections, MSPA began a slow, dangerous left roll. Swanson moved swiftly toward the rear of the flight deck, squeezing through the narrow crawlway leading into the bomb bay. Behind him, the bomber's nose dipped sharply. The control cables hung loose, lifeless in the slipstream. No one was holding the aircraft steady. Swanson could feel the B-17 accelerating into a dive, the seconds slipping away. 30 heart-pounding seconds remained before the dive angle became fatal, before G-forces pinned him in place, before MSPA could enter a deadly spin. He reached the waist gun area, bracing for the leap. The aluminum floor vibrated violently beneath his boots, the roar of the wind nearly deafening. Swanson grabbed his parachute pack from the storage rack, clipped it securely to his harness, and edged toward the window opening. MSPA was now in a steep dive, not vertical, but enough to force him to brace against the fuselage to stay upright. He positioned himself at the waist gun window, eyes on the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and leapt. The slipstream hit like a solid wall, throwing him sideways, spinning him violently as he plunged into open air, every second a test of nerve and survival. The B-17 streaked past, engines still roaring, already 200 feet ahead and plummeting faster. Swanson yanked the ripcord. The parachute snapped open with a violent jerk, knocking the air from his lungs. Then came relative silence. The engine roar faded as MSPA continued its downward spiral. Swanson watched in tense disbelief. The tail section was still attached, but barely. The entire rear fuselage flexed and twisted like a reed in a storm. At 15,000 feet, the tail finally tore away, sending the bomber into an uncontrollable, catastrophic descent. The B-17's forward section pitched sharply nose down, almost vertical. It plummeted for 8 seconds before disappearing into a line of trees 2 miles away. Moments later, a column of black smoke erupted. The fuel tanks had ignited on impact. Nothing survived that crash. No one could have. Had Swanson remained aboard even 30 more seconds, he would have been killed instantly. His parachute slowed his descent, carrying him southwest on the prevailing wind. Below stretched the Yugoslav landscape, scattered farms, dense forests, tiny villages. Somewhere beneath, German occupation forces waited, unaware that one lone American airman had just survived the impossible. Somewhere below, his crew members who had jumped minutes earlier drifted toward the ground. Somewhere below lay the harsh reality. His war was over. He was about to become a prisoner of war. The terrain surged upward faster than expected. Swanson spotted trees and attempted to steer the parachute toward an open field, but the canopy wasn't built for precision maneuvering. Now, the trees loomed directly beneath him. At roughly 15 miles per hour, he collided with the upper branches. Limbs snapped under impact, and the parachute canopy caught, jolting him violently, twisting him awkwardly, each second a battle between survival and injury. Swanson crashed through the dense foliage, slamming into a thick branch on his left side. A sickening snap echoed through his leg. Somewhere between the knee and ankle, the bone had broken cleanly. Pain surged like lightning through his nervous system. He fell another 10 feet, coming to rest tangled in parachute lines and shattered branches, 15 feet above the ground. Blood streamed down his leg. His flight suit was ripped and shredded, exposing deep lacerations across his left thigh where branches had torn through fabric and skin. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, every movement sending waves of agony through his body. He couldn't move his leg, couldn't bear weight, couldn't climb down from the tree. Suspended in his parachute harness, Swanson fought to control the pain, to stay conscious, to remain aware of every sound around him. Below, voices cut through the quiet, German voices. Within minutes, German soldiers reached the base of the tree. They were Wehrmacht infantry, part of the occupation force stationed in the area. They had seen the parachutes drifting down and heard the thunderous crash of the B-17. Now, They were closing in, ready to collect the surviving American aircrew. Swanson hung motionless in his harness, 15 feet above the ground, trapped and powerless. A soldier called up to him, but there was no response. The men quickly discussed how to bring him down safely. Spotting a ladder from a nearby farm, 2 soldiers climbed up, carefully cutting the parachute lines. They lowered Swanson gently, mindful not to worsen his shattered leg. Once on the ground, he was laid on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived, assessing the broken leg, deep lacerations, and significant blood loss, the harsh reality of his capture settling in with every breath. The medic fashioned a temporary splint using wooden boards and strips of cloth, stabilizing Swanson's shattered leg. Morphine from the medical kit was injected, and almost immediately, the searing pain dulled to a distant throb. The medic wrapped the deep lacerations carefully, checking for other injuries. Ribs appeared intact, no signs of head trauma, no detectable internal bleeding. The focus was clear, the leg. Without proper medical care, infection could set in, and the bone might never heal correctly. Yet, in this isolated forest clearing, with only limited supplies, the medic had done everything possible to keep Swanson alive. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post, then moved him to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor examined the broken leg, confirmed the fracture, and carefully set the bone. Despite the morphine, the procedure was excruciating. Swanson passed out twice from the pain. When he regained consciousness, his leg was encased in a plaster cast stretching from ankle to hip. Through an interpreter, the doctor explained that the fracture was clean. The bone would heal, but Swanson would face months of recovery, unable to walk normally. Each step a reminder of the chaos and danger he had survived. Over the next 3 days, the remainder of MSPA's crew was captured. All 8 men who had parachuted from the crippled bomber were located within a 20-meter radius of the crash site. None had managed to evade German forces. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled, farmland firmly under occupation, though partisan resistance hid in the nearby mountains. One by one, the men were brought to the same processing center. Swanson watched as they arrived. Berndt, Gmincy, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish, all alive, surprisingly uninjured aside from minor cuts and bruises, a small relief amid the relentless tension of their ordeal. Now all prisoners of war, the MSPA crew was transported to Austria, to Stalag Luft 4, a camp designated specifically for captured Allied airmen. The facility held roughly 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh, but not outright brutal. Food was limited, Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly, and the barracks were bitterly cold during winter. Medical care was basic, yet the Germans largely adhered to Geneva Convention standards for officer prisoners. For Swanson and his crew, survival now depended on endurance, patience, and holding on through the long, uncertain months ahead. There were no mass executions, no systematic torture, just confinement, monotony, and endless waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. The first 2 months were spent on crutches, every movement a test of patience. In September 1944, the cast was finally removed. Physical therapy was rudimentary. He walked the camp perimeter daily, gradually rebuilding strength in the injured leg. By October, he could move without assistance, and by November, the limp had almost vanished. Each small step was a victory, a quiet testament to resilience amid the endless uncertainty of life as a prisoner of war. By December, Swanson had physically recovered, yet the war raged on. The camp remained tightly secured, guards patrolling the wire relentlessly. Escape attempts were rare and almost always futile. The crew of MSPA settled into the slow rhythm of captivity. They recounted the mission, the 88mm shell that tore the nose away, the 10 harrowing minutes flying without a cockpit, the desperate hands pulling control cables, and the haunting sight of their bomber plummeting into the Yugoslav forest. They remembered Dudley and Henderson, lost instantly in the explosion and the thin line between life and death they had all crossed. And so they waited for the war to end, for liberation, for home. Winter gave way to spring. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Germans began evacuating the camps, forcing prisoners to march westward in long, grueling columns. Conditions worsened with every step. Food became scarce, exhaustion took its toll, and some men didn't survive the journey. A few took advantage of the chaos to escape, but Swanson and his crew stayed together, moving through a crumbling Germany as the Third Reich collapsed around them. Then, on April 30th, 1945, liberation came. American forces reached their column. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. Tanks rumbled past, soldiers handed out food, water, and cigarettes, and freedom finally returned. Medical personnel thoroughly examined the liberated prisoners, checking for injuries and disease. From there, they were transported to collection points, then to airfields, back to Italy, and finally to the United States. The crew of MSPA returned home. 8 men, all survivors. 8 men who had battled flak at 30,000 feet over Budapest, who had pulled control cables by hand to keep a dying bomber airborne, and who had jumped into the unknown and lived. First Lieutenant Evald Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan. He married, raised a family, and worked quietly for decades, carrying the memories of that fateful mission with him, but never letting them define him. Swanson rarely spoke of July 14, 1944. When asked, he would simply say he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, and that Dudley and Henderson had not been. He never saw himself as a hero, just a pilot who had carried out his duty under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces had a different view. Over the years, Swanson rose through the ranks, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. The honors recognized not a single mission, but a lifetime of service. Yet, for him, that one mission, the 10 harrowing minutes without a cockpit, remained the defining moment of his career. Those 10 minutes should have killed everyone aboard. Yet the crew survived. They remained in touch, attending reunions of the 483rd Bomb Group, meeting every few years to remember the war, their missions, and the comrades who never returned. The bond between them was unbreakable. They had endured the impossible, flying a B-17 with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, and exposed control cables whipped by 300 miles per hour wind. They survived through coordination, sheer determination, and an unyielding refusal to give up. In doing so, they honored Dudley and Henderson, ensuring that their sacrifice was never forgotten. Co-pilot Paul Berndt stayed close to Swanson in Michigan, their friendship lasting a lifetime. Frank Ramensi returned to his family, speaking little of the war. George Simonelli preserved photographs from that fateful mission, sharing them decades later with his grandchildren, recounting the harrowing ordeal of pulling steel cables as their bomber tore itself apart. The rest of the crew dispersed across the country, but the memory of that day never faded. Each man carried the story with him, a story of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond forged at 30,000 feet. They all remembered. Evald Swanson passed away in 2009 at the age of 89, leaving behind a life rich with experiences. He witnessed the world transform, from the age of propeller-driven bombers to jets and even spacecraft. Yet the machine that remained etched in his memory was always MSPA, the B-17G that had lost its nose over Budapest, the bomber that defied the odds, flying on sheer determination and human will. The aircraft that stood as a testament to courage, teamwork, and the extraordinary limits the human spirit could push beyond. If this story inspired you as much as it inspired us, please hit that like button. Every like helps share these forgotten stories with the world. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the incredible tales we uncover every day. Stories of bomber crews who refused to give up, even when the odds were impossible. Real people, real courage, real heroism. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or elsewhere. You're not just a viewer. You're helping keep these memories alive. Share your location, or let us know if someone in your family served. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping ensure that Evald Swanson and the crew of MSPA are never forgotten. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley and Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson died instantly when that 88mm shell struck, just 23 and 24 years old. They never made it home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory forward, through 9 months in a prisoner of war camp, for decades afterward in Michigan, and across the United States. And now, through this story, their names live on. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that possible.